Years after rescuing a helpless leopard cub, a man is surprised by the grown leopard returning to his doorstep, but the gift it brings leaves him questioning if he ever really knew the wild animal he saved. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jake Thompson's farmland as he made his way through the dew-covered grass. At 52, his weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the fence line of his property. Living alone for the past decade had given him plenty of time to perfect his routine. His boots left dark impressions in the wet grass as he walked, clipboard in hand, marking areas that needed repair. Jake paused at the eastern edge of his property, where his land met the forest. The fence here always needed extra attention, thanks to the local wildlife. He didn't mind. These moments of solitude at the forest's edge were often the highlight of his day. The property had been in his family for 3 generations, but Jake was the first to run it alone. His marriage had ended years ago, and his children had moved to the city, leaving him to manage the 100 acres by himself. The sound of rustling leaves caught his attention. Jake's mind drifted back to that day 7 years ago, when everything changed. He had been checking this same stretch of fence when he heard gunshots echoing through the trees. Without thinking, he had grabbed his rifle and headed into the forest, following the sound. The memory was still vivid. The scared whimpers, the trail of blood drops on fallen leaves, and finally, the sight of the leopard cub huddled beneath a fallen log, trembling. The poacher had been easy enough to scare off. Most weren't prepared for an angry farmer with a rifle and a legitimate claim to the land. The cub, however, had been a different matter entirely. Its leg was wounded, not severely, but enough to need care. Jake had never considered himself an animal person, but something in those frightened eyes had touched him. He had wrapped the cub in his jacket, careful of its injured leg, and carried it back to his barn. For 3 weeks, Jake had nursed the leopard cub back to health. He kept it secret from the authorities, knowing they might take the animal away to a zoo or wildlife center. Instead, he read veterinary books late into the night and used his farming experience to care for the wounded creature. The cub had grown stronger each day, its personality emerging as it healed, playful but dignified, as if aware of its royal heritage, even as a juvenile. When the time came to release it, Jake had done so with mixed emotions. He drove deep into the forest, far from hunting grounds and human settlements, and opened the cage door. The cub had lingered for a moment, looking back at him with those intelligent eyes, before disappearing into the undergrowth. Jake had told himself it was better this way, that wild animals belonged in the wild. But the memory of those 3 weeks had stayed with him. Now, 7 years later, Jake stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. There, on his back porch, sat a fully grown leopard. The morning light caught its spotted coat, highlighting the muscular frame that spoke of years of successful hunting. But it was the eyes that Jake recognized immediately, the same intelligent gaze that had looked up at him from that makeshift bed in his barn years ago. The leopard wasn't alone. In its mouth, catching the early morning light, was something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. A necklace of pearls, unlike anything he had ever seen, hung from the big cat's jaws. The pearls seemed to glow with an inner light, their surface marked with strange symbols that Jake couldn't identify. For a long moment, neither moved. Jake stood transfixed behind his kitchen window, and the leopard sat calmly on the porch, as if this was a perfectly normal way to start the day. Then, with deliberate care, the leopard placed the necklace on the welcome mat. It looked directly at Jake, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw something like recognition in those amber eyes. Then, with the same grace it had arrived with, the leopard turned and disappeared into the morning mist. Jake waited several minutes before opening his back door. The necklace lay there, pearls gleaming with an otherworldly sheen. As he picked it up, the weight of it surprised him. It felt both ancient and alive somehow, as if carrying stories within its smooth surface. Looking out at the tree line where the leopard had vanished, Jake knew his life was about to change again. though he couldn't have said how he knew it. The mystery of where the necklace came from, and why his old friend had brought it to him, would soon lead him down a path he never expected to travel. Jake sat at his kitchen table, turning the pearl necklace over in his hands. The morning light streaming through the window caught each pearl differently, creating an effect that reminded him of moonlight on water. The inscriptions weren't like anything he'd seen before. Small, intricate symbols that seemed to flow into each other, more like natural patterns than human writing. He pulled his reading glasses from his shirt pocket and leaned in closer. The symbols appeared to be carved directly into the pearls, but the surface remained perfectly smooth to the touch. Some pearls showed what looked like animal shapes, birds in flight, running deer, and what might have been a leopard. Others contained more geometric patterns that reminded Jake of the Native American art he'd seen in local museums. The clasp was made of some dark metal he couldn't identify, worked into the shape of two intertwined leaves. After making a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, Jake drove into town. Millbrook's library was housed in an old Victorian building that had seen better days, but its local history section was surprisingly comprehensive. Miss Harris, the head librarian, who had worked there since Jake was a boy, looked up from her computer as he entered. "Jake Thompson, twice in 1 year. The world must be ending," she said with a smile. Jake managed an awkward laugh, realizing he hadn't been to the library since researching crop rotation patterns last spring. "Need to look into some local history, Sarah," he replied, pulling the necklace from his pocket. "Particularly anything about Native American artifacts from the area." Miss Harris's eyes widened at the sight of the necklace. "That's quite a piece," she said, reaching for her glasses. "Reminds me of something I saw in a book about the Wapiti tribe that used to live in this region. Follow me." She led him through the stacks to a section of leather-bound books. The smell of old paper and dust filled the air as she pulled several volumes from the shelves. "The Wapiti were here long before European settlers arrived," she explained, setting the books on a nearby table. "They were known for their close relationship with the local wildlife. Some even said they could communicate with animals." Jake spent the next several hours poring over the books. The Wapiti tribe had indeed lived in the area for centuries. Before being forced onto reservations in the late 1800s, they were skilled craftsmen, known for their intricate beadwork and pearl carving. Several photographs showed similar necklaces, though none quite matched the one Jake had. As he was about to leave, a thin volume caught his eye. Unlike the others, this one was hand-bound, its cover made of faded leather. The title, barely legible, read Journal of Samuel Blackwood, 1876. Jake carefully opened it, and a loose page fell out. The handwriting was faded, but still readable. March 15th, 1876. "Today, I witnessed something extraordinary. The Wapiti elder, Grey Wolf, showed me what he called the spirit pearls. He claimed they were given to his people by the forest guardians, great cats that protected their lands. The pearls," he said, "held ancient magic that connected the wearer to the natural world. I would dismiss such tales as superstition, but I saw things today that I cannot explain. The way animals responded to those wearing the necklaces, as if they recognized them as kin rather than strangers." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he read. The journal went on to describe the Wapiti's belief in animal guardians, particularly the great cats that they said watched over the forest. According to their legends, these guardians would sometimes choose human allies, bringing them gifts of power and wisdom. Miss Harris found him still reading as the afternoon light began to fade. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked, turning on the table lamp. "Maybe more than I was looking for," Jake replied, carefully closing the journal. "Is there anyone left from the Wapiti tribe in the area?" "There's a small reservation about 40 miles north," she said. "They still maintain some of their traditional ways, from what I hear, though they don't much care for visitors." Jake nodded, gathering his notes. The reservation would be his next stop, but he needed time to process what he'd learned. The necklace in his pocket seemed heavier now, weighted with history and possibility. The leopard's appearance with this specific artifact couldn't be coincidence, but the implications were almost too fantastic to consider. As he drove home through the gathering dusk, Jake's mind raced. If the journal was accurate, if the legends held any truth, then the leopard he'd saved wasn't just a wild animal. It was something more, a guardian that had chosen him for some purpose he didn't yet understand. The question was, what did it want him to do with this knowledge? He pulled into his driveway, just as the first stars were appearing. In the distance, he heard what might have been a leopard's call, though it could have been the wind. Either way, Jake knew his simple life as a farmer had become something far more complicated. Tomorrow, he would drive to the reservation, but tonight, he had a lot of thinking to do about everything he'd learned in that library. The drive to the Wapiti reservation took Jake through increasingly remote countryside. His truck bumped along the narrow road, as pine forests gave way to open meadows and back again. He'd left early, hoping to arrive before noon, the necklace secure in his jacket pocket. Every so often, he found himself reaching in to touch it, as if to reassure himself it was still there. The reservation entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign, weathered but well maintained. A small security booth stood nearby, staffed by a young man who regarded Jake with polite suspicion. After explaining his purpose, though carefully omitting any mention of the leopard, Jake was directed to the tribal council office, a modest building that blended naturally with its surroundings. Inside, Jake found himself face to face with Robert Standing Bear, one of the tribal elders. The old man's face was deeply lined, but his dark eyes were sharp and alert. He sat behind a desk decorated with traditional crafts, a computer looking oddly out of place among the hand-woven baskets and ceremonial items. "So," Standing Bear said, after Jake had introduced himself, "you've come about our history." His tone was neutral, but Jake could sense the wariness behind it. The tribe had likely dealt with plenty of curiosity seekers over the years. Jake carefully placed the necklace on the desk between them. The effect was immediate. Standing Bear's composed expression faltered, his eyes widening slightly as he leaned forward to examine the pearls. "Where did you get this?" The elder's voice had lost its professional detachment, replaced by something more urgent. Jake took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. "A leopard brought it to me," he said, then added quickly, "the same leopard I saved as a cub 7 years ago." For a long moment, Standing Bear said nothing. He stared at Jake as if seeing him for the first time, then nodded slowly. "Follow me," he said, standing. "This conversation requires a different setting." They walked behind the council building to a small, circular structure Jake hadn't noticed before. Standing Bear explained it was a traditional meeting house, used for important tribal discussions. Inside, the air was cool and dim, sunlight filtering through small windows near the roof. They sat on woven mats, and the elder lit a small bundle of sage, letting its smoke drift between them. "The necklace you carry," Standing Bear began, "is one of our most sacred artifacts. We call it the Guardian's Token. According to our stories, it was given to our people centuries ago by the spirit guardians of the forest, the great cats your leopard belongs to." Jake listened intently as Standing Bear explained the legend. "The Guardians," he said, "were more than just animals. They were protectors of the natural world, possessed of wisdom and power beyond human understanding. Sometimes, they would choose human allies, people they deemed worthy of sharing their mission. The fact that the Guardian brought you this token," Standing Bear said, "is significant. Our legends say this happens only in times of great need, when the balance between the human world and the natural world is threatened." As if on cue, Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He apologized and checked it quickly, then felt his stomach sink. It was an email from the County Development Board, confirming tomorrow's meeting about the proposed Mountain Vista Resort, a project that would clear hundreds of acres of forest land. Standing Bear noticed his expression. "What troubles you?" Jake explained about the resort project. how developers planned to build on land adjacent to his property, land that he now realized must be part of the Leopard's territory. As he spoke, he could see understanding dawn in the elder's eyes. "Now you begin to see," Standing Bear said softly. "The Guardian didn't choose you by accident. You're connected to this land, not just as an owner, but as someone who has shown respect for its creatures. The token was given to you because you're in a position to make a difference." The elder went on to explain how the necklace, according to tribal beliefs, could enhance one's connection to the natural world. Those who wore it with pure intentions could better understand the needs of the land and its inhabitants. Some stories even spoke of wearers being able to communicate with animals, though Standing Bear was quick to add that such tales might be metaphorical. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself sharing more about his life, his solitude on the farm, his growing appreciation for the wildlife around his property, and his unease about the changes the resort would bring. Standing Bear listened attentively, occasionally adding insights about the tribe's traditional view of land stewardship. "You face a difficult path," the elder said finally. "The token brings both power and responsibility. Our people learned long ago that standing against what others call progress requires great courage, and often comes at a personal cost." Before Jake left, Standing Bear performed a brief ceremony, blessing both him and the necklace. The elder also gave him a small book of tribal histories, marked with specific passages about the Guardians and their human allies. "Remember," Standing Bear said as they parted, "the Guardian chose you for a reason. Trust in that choice, even when the way forward seems unclear." Driving home, Jake felt the weight of his new understanding settling over him. The resort project, which had seemed like a distant concern before, now felt like an immediate threat. He thought about the leopard, about the forest it protected, and about the choice he now faced. The necklace in his pocket seemed to pulse with energy, as if responding to his thoughts. Just before sunset, as he turned onto the road leading to his farm, Jake caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees. A flash of spotted fur, there and gone in an instant. He smiled slightly, no longer surprised by his feline friends' appearances. They were in this together now, whether he was ready for it or not. The Mountain Vista Resort presentation room buzzed with anticipation. Jake sat near the back, feeling out of place in his clean but worn flannel shirt among the sleek suits and designer dresses. The necklace, hidden beneath his collar, seemed to grow warmer against his skin. He'd decided to wear it today, though he couldn't exactly explain why. Marcus Chen, the lead developer, stood at the podium, clicking through polished slides showing architectural renderings of the proposed resort. Phase 1 includes a 200-room luxury hotel, 3 restaurants, and a golf course, he explained, his voice confident and practiced. Subsequent phases will add vacation homes and an adventure sports complex. The images showed modern buildings nestled among the trees, their glass walls reflecting the forest. It looked beautiful, Jake had to admit, if you didn't think too hard about what would be destroyed to create it. His hand unconsciously moved to touch the necklace as Chen continued. "We're projecting 300 permanent jobs and an annual economic impact of $50 million for the region," Chen said, drawing approving murmurs from the crowd. "The Mountain Vista Resort will put Millbrook on the map as a premier tourist destination." Jake studied the faces around him. Most of the local business owners looked excited, probably already calculating potential profits. A few farmers like himself seemed more reserved, perhaps thinking about the changes such development would bring. The county commissioners sat in the front row, trying to maintain neutral expressions, but failing to hide their enthusiasm. During the question period, Sarah Miller, who owned the local diner, stood up. "What about environmental impacts?" she asked. "That's prime wildlife habitat you're planning to build on." Chun's smile never wavered. "We've conducted extensive environmental studies," he replied smoothly. "Our design includes wildlife corridors and preserved green spaces. We're committed to sustainable development." Jake couldn't help himself. He raised his hand and was acknowledged. "Those studies," he said, standing slowly, "did they account for the leopard population in the area?" A hush fell over the room. Chun's smile flickered slightly. "I'm not aware of any confirmed leopard sightings in this region," he said carefully. "Our wildlife survey focused on documented local species." "I've seen them," Jake persisted, aware of all eyes on him. One in particular. "These animals need large territories to survive. The resort would cut right through their hunting grounds." "Mr. Thompson," Chen said, his tone growing less friendly, "while we appreciate your concern, we can't base multi-million-dollar development decisions on unverified wildlife sightings. Perhaps you'd like to review our environmental impact report in detail." After the meeting, as people filed out, Jake found himself cornered by Richard Hayes, one of the county commissioners. Hayes had known Jake's father and always treated Jake with a sort of paternal condescension. "Jake, son," Hayes said quietly, "I know you care about the land, but this resort could transform our economy. Think about the opportunities it could create for your own property. The developers are very interested in your acreage." Jake felt the necklace grow warmer still. "My land isn't for sale, Richard." Hayes sighed. "No one's talking about selling yet, but property taxes are going up. Farming's getting harder every year. Maybe it's time to think about the future." Before Jake could respond, Sarah Miller approached them. "I liked what you said in there, Jake," she said. "Someone needs to speak up for the wildlife. My customers don't come here to see golf courses. They come for the natural beauty." Hayes excused himself, leaving Jake and Sarah to talk. She owned one of the few businesses in town that might actually lose customers to the resort's restaurants. As they discussed the meeting, others joined them. Tom Fletcher, who ran the local hardware store, and Maria Gonzalez, whose family had farmed the valley for generations. "We need to organize," Maria said firmly. "Get more people involved. Make sure everyone understands what's at stake." Jake nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The resort project had seemed unstoppable, backed by big money and political influence. But standing there with his neighbors, the necklace warm against his skin, he began to see possibilities. The leopard had chosen him for a reason, and maybe this small group was just the beginning. His phone buzzed. Another email from the development company, this one marked confidential. Opening it, Jake found a formal offer to purchase his land at well above market value. The amount made his breath catch. It was enough to retire comfortably, to give his kids the inheritance he'd always wanted to provide. For a moment, Jake felt the full weight of the choice before him. The money could change his life, secure his future. But as he thought about the leopard, about Standing Bear's words, about the ancient pearls against his skin, he knew it wasn't really a choice at all. "We need to meet," he told the others. "Tomorrow night, I have something to share that might help our cause." He touched the necklace again, wondering how they would react to his story, knowing he had to try. As the group dispersed, Jake walked to his truck. The sunset painted the forest in deep oranges and reds, and for a moment, he thought he saw a familiar shape moving among the trees. The leopard was watching, waiting to see what its chosen ally would do next. Jake straightened his shoulders and started his truck. The real fight was just beginning. The community center buzzed with voices as people filed in for the meeting. Jake stood at the front, watching familiar faces fill the folding chairs. Sarah Miller had spread the word through her diner, and Maria Gonzalez had rallied the farming community. Even some local teachers and high school students had shown up, carrying hand-drawn signs protesting the resort development. Tom Fletcher was setting up a projector, planning to show maps of the affected wildlife areas. Jake fingered the necklace beneath his shirt, gathering his courage. What he planned to share tonight would either rally the community or make him sound completely crazy. "Thanks for coming," Jake began, once everyone was seated. The room quieted, about 50 pairs of eyes fixed on him. "We're here because our community faces a choice. The resort developers want us to believe it's a choice between progress and stagnation. but it's really about something deeper. He moved to the front of the makeshift stage, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. This land has been home to more than just humans. The Wapiti tribe lived here for generations before us. The wildlife, deer, bears, and yes, leopards, still call these forests home. We're not just fighting for property values or business interests. We're fighting for a way of life that understands the value of wild places. A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of leopards. Jake saw Richard Hayes at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching intently. Several county officials sat near him, their expressions skeptical. "I know some of you think I'm imagining things about the leopard," Jake continued. "So I want to share something." He reached up and pulled out the necklace, letting it catch the fluorescent light. The pearls seemed to glow with their own inner fire. Standing Bear had agreed to attend, and now he rose from his seat. "This necklace," the elder said, his voice carrying clearly, "is a sacred artifact of my people. It was given to Jake by one of the forest guardians, the leopard he speaks of. Our legends say such gifts come only in times of great need." The room erupted in whispers. Jake saw Hayes lean forward, his skepticism giving way to intense interest. Sarah Miller stood up, her face animated. "I saw the leopard too," she announced. "Last week, at dawn, behind my diner. I thought I was seeing things, but it was real." Others began sharing stories, glimpses of a large cat in the woods, unexplained tracks, livestock that had gone mysteriously unmolested despite a predator's presence. Each story added weight to Jake's words, though he could see some in the audience remained unconvinced. Maria Gonzalez raised her hand. "The necklace is beautiful, Jake, but how does it help us stop the resort?" Jake touched one of the pearls, feeling its warmth. "It reminds us that we're not alone in this fight." The Wapiti lived in harmony with these lands for centuries. They understood something we've forgotten, that we're part of nature, not separate from it. The resort developers see empty land to be filled. We see a living ecosystem that deserves protection. He clicked to the next slide, showing the resort's planned layout. "Look at what we stand to lose. These aren't just trees and rocks. This is a complex web of life that's existed for thousands of years. Once it's gone, we can't get it back." The meeting continued for hours. People shared ideas, formed committees, planned protests and letter-writing campaigns. Jake watched it unfold, feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. The necklace had brought people together, but would it be enough? Near the end, a teenage girl approached Jake, her eyes bright with purpose. "My environmental science class would like to help," she said. "We can document the wildlife, maybe set up cameras to prove the leopard exists." Before Jake could respond, Hayes appeared beside them. "Jake," he said quietly, "could we speak privately?" In the empty hallway, Hayes studied the necklace more closely. "You really believe all this? About guardian spirits and ancient connections?" Jake met his gaze steadily. "I believe we have a responsibility to protect what's irreplaceable. You knew my father, Richard. What would he say about trading our heritage for a golf course?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "The developers won't give up easily," he finally said. "They've invested too much already, and some people in town really want this resort." "I know," Jake replied, "but maybe there's a middle ground, something that brings progress without destruction." As people filed out into the night, Jake felt both exhausted and energized. The meeting had achieved more than he'd hoped, but it was just the beginning. Standing Bear lingered behind, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You've taken the first step," the elder said. "The Guardian chose well." Jake nodded, looking out the window at the dark forest beyond the parking lot. Somewhere out there, his leopard friend was watching, waiting. The necklace pulsed warmly against his skin, reminding him that in this fight, ancient wisdom and modern necessity would have to find a way to coexist. Jake's truck bounced down the familiar suburban street in Springfield, 2 hours from his farm. The necklace lay hidden beneath his shirt as he pulled into his daughter Amy's driveway. He hadn't visited in 8 months, not since last Christmas. When dinner had devolved into another argument about him being stuck in the past with the farm, Amy opened the door before he could knock, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. At 32, she looked more like her mother every day. "Dad, you didn't call first. Thought I'd surprise you," Jake said, managing a smile. "Is Michael home too? He's picking up Emma from soccer practice." She stepped aside to let him in. The house smelled of coffee and fresh bread, so different from his farmhouse's perpetual scent of hay and earth. "Is everything okay? You never just show up." Jake followed her to the kitchen, where she'd been grading papers for her middle school class. "Things are changing back home," he said carefully. "I needed to talk to you and your brother about it." Amy's face tightened. "If this is about keeping the farm in the family again, it's not," Jake interrupted. "Well, not exactly. It's bigger than that." They sat at the kitchen table, and Jake told her everything. The leopard cub from 7 years ago, its return with the necklace, Standing Bear's explanations, and the resort development threat. Amy listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern to something harder to read. "Dad," she said finally. "This sounds crazy," Jake finished. "I know, but it's real, Amy. All of it." He pulled out the necklace, letting it rest on the table between them. The pearls caught the afternoon light, their inscriptions seeming to move slightly. Amy reached out hesitantly to touch one of the pearls. "It's warm," she said, sounding surprised. The front door opened, and Michael's voice carried down the hall. "Mum, Emma scored 2 goals." His words cut off as he entered the kitchen and saw Jake. 9-year-old Emma peeked around her father, her soccer uniform still dirty from practice. "Grandpa." She rushed forward to hug him, then noticed the necklace. "What's that?" Over the next hour, Jake repeated his story. Michael, who worked in finance in the city, asked pointed questions about the resort development and property values. Emma sat cross-legged in her chair, completely absorbed in the tale of the leopard. "So you're going to stop them from building the resort?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. "I'm trying," Jake said. "But I need help. The developers have a lot of money and influence." Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his mother's that it made Jake's chest tighten. "Dad, even if everything you're saying is true, you're talking about fighting some serious corporate interests. They could take everything you have." "They already offered to buy the farm," Jake admitted, "well above market value." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Jake knew what they were thinking. About college funds for Emma, about the retirement he couldn't afford, about all the practical concerns he'd struggled with since their mother left. "Can I see the leopard?" Emma asked suddenly. "If I come visit?" "Emma," Michael started, but Jake cut in. "Maybe. He seems to show up when he's needed." Jake touched the necklace. "Standing Bear says the guardians choose when to reveal themselves." Amy had been quiet, studying the necklace. "You know," she said slowly, "my students just finished a unit on local ecosystems. They'd probably be very interested in this. The resort would destroy more than just wildlife habitat," Jake explained. "It's about the connection between the land and the people who live there. Your grandfather understood that. He used to say, 'We don't own the land, we're its caretakers.'" Michael sat down heavily. "I remember him saying that. Mum used to get so frustrated when he talked that way." He looked at Emma, then back at Jake. "What do you need from us?" "Support," Jake said simply. "Maybe some help documenting the wildlife, building our case. Emma's soccer team might enjoy a camping weekend at the farm. And Amy, if your students want to get involved." "A field trip," Amy nodded. "We could combine science and local history. I'll talk to the principal." They talked into the evening, ordering pizza when dinner time came. Emma convinced them to eat on the back patio, saying it felt more like being at the farm. As the sun set, Jake noticed her watching the trees behind the house intently. "The leopard wouldn't come here," he told her gently. "Too many houses." "I know," she said, "but I'm practicing looking for him, for when I visit." Later, as Jake prepared to drive home, Michael walked him to his truck. "Dad, he said. "I still think this is crazy, but..." He paused, looking back at the house where Emma was excitedly showing Amy something on her tablet. Probably researching leopards. "Maybe crazy is what we need right now. Just be careful, okay?" Jake nodded, touching the necklace through his shirt. The warmth seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. "I will be, and Michael, thank you." Driving home through the darkness, Jake felt lighter than he had in years. His family might not fully understand or believe everything, but they were trying. Sometimes, he reflected, that's all you could ask for. The willingness to try. The forest seemed to welcome him as he turned onto the road to his farm. In the beam of his headlights, he caught a glimpse of something moving. A familiar, spotted form, keeping pace with his truck for a moment before disappearing into the trees. Jake smiled. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore, in more ways than one. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Jake stood in his kitchen, reading and rereading the formal notice. Construction of Mountain Vista Resort will commence in 30 days. All pending environmental reviews have been approved. His hands shook slightly as he set the paper down, the necklace growing uncomfortably warm against his skin. His phone buzzed with messages from others who'd received similar notices. Sarah Miller sent a photo of bulldozers already parked at the edge of town. Maria Gonzalez reported seeing surveyors marking boundaries on land adjacent to her farm. The development was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Jake called Standing Bear immediately. "They're saying all the environmental reviews are complete," he said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "How's that possible? They never documented the leopard. They don't want to find what they don't wish to see." Standing Bear replied gravely, "But we may have one last chance. The full moon ceremony is in 3 days. It's traditionally when the guardians are most likely to reveal themselves." Jake paced his kitchen, the morning sun casting long shadows across the floor. 3 days. The investors are holding their final meeting tomorrow. Once they transfer the funds, then we must act tonight. Standing Bear interrupted. "Call your people, all of them. I'll bring the elders. It's time to show the community what they stand to lose." Over the next few hours, Jake's farm became a hub of frantic activity. Amy arrived with 3 busloads of middle school students, armed with cameras and wildlife observation logs. Michael took a day off work to help organize the documentation teams. Emma convinced her entire soccer team to come, their parents joining in to supervise the excited kids. Local news vans appeared after Sarah tipped off reporters about the Citizen Science Initiative. Jake watched from his porch as people spread out across his property and into the surrounding forest, setting up observation posts and wildlife cameras. As dusk approached, Standing Bear and several tribal elders arrived. They set up a small ceremony area at the edge of the forest, burning sage and setting out traditional offerings. The smell of smoke mixed with the evening air, and Jake felt the necklace growing warmer still. "Look!" Emma's shout cut through the gathering darkness. All heads turned toward the tree line. There, in the fading light, stood the leopard. Its spotted coat seemed to shimmer in the dusk, its eyes reflecting the light of the ceremonial fire. Cameras clicked rapidly. The news crews scrambled to get better angles, but the leopard paid them no attention. It walked with deliberate grace toward Jake and Standing Bear, something clutched in its mouth. As it drew closer, Jake saw it was carrying another necklace, similar to his, but older, its pearls darker with age. The leopard placed the second necklace at Standing Bear's feet, then moved to stand between them. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Standing Bear picked up the ancient necklace, his hands trembling slightly. "The Guardian offers proof," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "These pearls were buried with our ancestors centuries ago. Their return now is a sign that cannot be ignored." The leopard remained in place as darkness fell, allowing itself to be photographed and filmed. Local scientists who had been skeptical of Jake's claims arrived to document the unprecedented event. Social media exploded with images and videos, drawing more people to the farm. Near midnight, Jake's phone rang. It was Richard Hayes. "Turn on the news," the commissioner said without preamble. "The resort investors are calling an emergency meeting. This changes everything." But before Jake could celebrate, a new sound cut through the night. The rumble of heavy machinery. Headlights appeared on the access road, and Jake recognized Marcus Chen's car leading a convoy of construction vehicles. "They're trying to start early," Michael said, running up to Jake. "Before we can file injunctions." The Leopard's head snapped toward the approaching vehicles. It let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Then, to everyone's amazement, more eyes appeared in the darkness behind it. 2, 4, 6 pairs, gleaming in the firelight. More guardians, standing bare-breathed. They've come to stand with their brother. The construction convoy ground to a halt as multiple leopards emerged from the forest, arranging themselves in a line between the machines and the land they sought to destroy. Camera flashes lit up the night as reporters captured the unprecedented scene. Marcus Chen stepped out of his car, his face pale in the headlights. "This is private property," he called out, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "No," Jake replied, stepping forward with the necklace glowing visibly against his chest. "This is their territory. It always has been. We're the guests here." The standoff continued into the early morning hours. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the scene live across the country. Environmental groups began arriving, adding their voices to the protest. But it was the images of the leopards, standing silent guard over their forest, that captured the world's imagination. As dawn approached, Jake received another call, this time from the governor's office. The possibility of declaring the area a protected wildlife sanctuary was being discussed. The resort development would need to be re-evaluated in light of new evidence. But Jake knew the fight wasn't over. As the sun rose over his farm, now the center of national attention, he touched the warm pearls at his throat and watched the leopards melt back into their forest. They had shown themselves when needed most, but the real work of protecting their home was just beginning. The days following the leopard's appearance transformed Jake's quiet farm into an impromptu command center. A large tent had been set up in his front field, filled with folding tables, laptops, and environmental experts. Local volunteers worked alongside professional conservationists, all united by the previous night's extraordinary events. Dr. Alina Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist from the State University, stood before a wall covered in maps and photographs. "What we're seeing is unprecedented," she explained to the assembled group. "A breeding population of leopards, previously undocumented in this region. Their territory extends far beyond what we initially thought." Jake sat at the back of the tent, the necklace humming with constant warmth now. Sarah Miller had set up a food station nearby, keeping everyone supplied with coffee and sandwiches. The local newspaper lay on the table beside him, its headline reading, "Guardians of the Forest. Ancient legend meets modern conservation." The environmental impact studies conducted by the resort developers were clearly inadequate. Dr. Rodriguez continued, pointing to highlighted areas on the map. They completely missed not just the leopards, but several critical wildlife corridors that would have been destroyed by construction. Standing Bear, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Our people have always known about the Guardians. Perhaps now is the time to share more of our traditional knowledge about these lands." A young environmental lawyer named David Chen, no relation to Marcus, stepped forward. "The combination of documented wildlife presence and indigenous cultural significance gives us a strong legal case. I've already filed for an emergency injunction against any construction." The meeting was interrupted by Emma bursting into the tent, still wearing her soccer uniform from morning practice. "Grandpa, you need to see this." She held up her tablet, showing a social media feed. The hashtag Guardian Leopards was trending nationwide, with millions sharing the photos and videos from that night. "It's not just local anymore," Michael added, following his daughter in environmental groups from across the country are pledging support. Some major wildlife organizations want to help establish a permanent sanctuary. Amy, who had been working with her students to document local flora and fauna, joined them with her own updates. The school board approved an environmental education program based on what's happening here. Other schools are asking to participate too. Jake felt overwhelmed by the sudden surge of support, but the necklace's steady warmth helped center him. These were exactly the allies they needed, even if the attention was far more than he'd ever expected. Maria Gonzalez arrived with more news. The Native American Rights Fund has offered legal support. They're interested in protecting both the wildlife and the cultural heritage. She paused, then added with a slight smile, and Richard Hayes called. He wants to meet. The meeting with Hayes took place that afternoon in Jake's kitchen, away from the bustling tent. The commissioner looked tired but determined. The resort developers are willing to negotiate, he said without preamble. They're floating the idea of a scaled-back project, built farther from the critical wildlife areas. Jake touched the necklace. That's not good enough, he said quietly. We need to protect the entire ecosystem. Hayes nodded, surprising Jake. I agree. Actually, I have an alternative proposal. He spread out a different set of plans on the kitchen table. What if, instead of a resort, we developed a world-class wildlife research and education center? We could create jobs, draw tourists, and protect the land all at once. The idea caught Jake off guard. It was exactly the kind of compromise they needed. A way to bring progress without destruction. The necklace felt particularly warm as he studied the plans. There's more, Hayes continued. Several conservation groups are willing to help fund it. They see this as a chance to create a model for sustainable development. The leopard's appearance has created opportunities we never imagined. Throughout the day, more supporters arrived. A team of wildlife photographers set up camera stations throughout the forest. Anthropologists came to consult with Standing Bear and the tribal elders about documenting their traditional knowledge. Local business owners, led by Sarah Miller, began developing plans for ecotourism initiatives that would complement the proposed research center. As evening approached, Jake walked to the edge of his property, seeking a moment of quiet. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Movement in the trees caught his eye. The leopard, his leopard, watching from the shadows. We're trying, he said softly to his friend. People are finally starting to understand. The big cat blinked slowly, its golden eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Then it turned and melted into the forest. But Jake didn't feel abandoned. He knew the guardian was still there, watching, waiting to see if humans would finally learn to be proper stewards of the land. Back at the farm, the tent glowed with light as people continued working into the night. Emma had fallen asleep on a stack of wildlife photos, her tablet still showing the ever-growing support on social media. Michael and Amy were deep in discussion with Dr. Rodriguez about funding opportunities for the research center. Standing Bear approached Jake as he returned. The Guardians have given us a chance, the elder said. Now we must prove worthy of their trust. Jake nodded, watching his family, his community, and complete strangers all working together to protect something precious. The necklace pulsed warmly, reminding him that sometimes the greatest changes start with a single act of kindness, like saving a leopard cub on a routine morning 7 years ago. The morning of the final county commission meeting dawned clear and cold. Jake stood before his bathroom mirror, carefully settling the necklace over his tie. The first time he'd worn one since his father's funeral. The pearls seemed to pulse with an unusual intensity today, as if they too understood the importance of what lay ahead. Outside the county courthouse, hundreds of people had gathered. Environmental activists stood alongside farmers, tribal members next to business owners. Emma's soccer team had come in their uniforms, holding hand-painted signs showing leopards. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the morning sky. Inside the packed meeting room, Marcus Chen and his development team occupied one side, their lawyers arranging documents on the table before them. Jake noticed Chen looked tired, the past weeks of controversy and negative publicity having taken their toll. The commission will now hear final arguments regarding the Mountain Vista Resort development proposal, Commissioner Hayes announced, his voice carrying through the crowded room. Mr. Chen, you have the floor. Chen stood, straightening his expensive suit. The economic benefits of this project cannot be ignored, he began. We've revised our plans to address environmental concerns. The new proposal reduces our footprint by 30% and includes significant wildlife protection measures. He clicked through slides showing the modified resort plans. We're prepared to establish a conservation fund and work with local environmental groups to ensure a commotion. At the back of the room interrupted him. People were standing, pointing through the windows. Jake turned and felt his heart skip a beat. There, in broad daylight, the Leopard stood on the courthouse lawn. As phones came out to capture images, more shapes emerged from the morning mist. The entire group of guardians, arranging themselves in a semicircle visible to everyone in the meeting room. Standing Bear rose slowly. The guardians have come to witness our decision, he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. They show themselves not to threaten, but to remind us of what truly matters. Jake felt the necklace grow almost hot against his skin as he stood to make his presentation. On the screen behind him, Dr. Rodriguez's research data appeared alongside photographs of the leopards. Maps showed their territorial range, their hunting patterns, the complex web of wildlife that depended on the unbroken forest habitat. We're not just deciding about a resort today, Jake said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. We're deciding what kind of future we want. The developers see empty land waiting to be filled. We see a living ecosystem that's existed for thousands of years. He touched the necklace, drawing strength from its warmth. But we're not saying no to progress. We're proposing something better. He nodded to Hayes, who unveiled the alternative plans for the Wildlife Research Center, a facility that will bring sustainable jobs, educational opportunities, and international recognition to our community, while protecting what makes this place special. The room buzzed with excitement as Jake detailed the support they'd gathered. Major conservation groups, research universities, ecotourism operators, even some of Chen's original investors had expressed interest in backing the new project. The guardians chose to reveal themselves. Jake continued, gesturing to the leopards still visible outside. They're trusting us to make the right choice. This isn't just about saving wildlife. It's about remembering who we are and our responsibility to the land that sustains us. As he spoke, Emma slipped away from her parents and walked to the window. The youngest leopard, barely more than a cub, approached the glass. Those watching held their breath as girl and wild cat studied each other, separated by mere inches of glass, yet connected by something ancient and profound. My granddaughter will grow up in whatever world we choose today, Jake said softly. Will it be one where we've learned to coexist with nature, or one where we've traded our heritage for short-term profit? Chen stood again, but his usual confidence was gone. Looking at the leopards outside, then at the packed room of community members, he seemed to deflate slightly. Perhaps, he said slowly, we need to reconsider our approach. The commission called a brief recess to review all the materials. Jake stepped outside, the necklace guiding him toward the leopards. His old friend, the one he'd saved as a cub, moved forward to meet him. Behind them, Emma was explaining to a group of wide-eyed children about the wildlife cameras she'd helped set up, while Amy recorded everything for her classroom. Standing Bear joined them, holding his own ancient necklace. Whatever happens today, he said, the Guardians have already achieved something remarkable. They've helped us remember what we were in danger of forgetting. Jake nodded, watching the morning sun glint off the leopard's spotted coat. In its eyes, he saw not just an animal, but a bridge between worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the past and the future, human needs and natural law. The necklace pulsed warmly, reminding him that some bonds, once formed, cannot be broken. The commission was about to reconvene for their final decision. As Jake turned to go back inside, he felt more certain than ever that they stood on the edge of something momentous, not just for their community, but for anyone who had ever needed reminding that some things are worth protecting at any cost. The commission's decision was unanimous, as Hayes read the final verdict, rejecting the resort development and approving the Wildlife Research Center. The room erupted in cheers. But it was what happened next that would be remembered for generations to come. Marcus Chen, looking both defeated and oddly relieved, approached Jake in front of everyone. "I was wrong," he said, extending his hand. "I saw empty space where there was actually something full of life. My company would like to be the first to contribute to the Research Center's foundation." The necklace glowed with unprecedented warmth as Jake shook Chun's hand. Outside, the leopards remained in their semicircle, as if bearing witness to this moment of reconciliation between development and conservation. Standing Bear stepped forward, raising both necklaces, his ancient one and Jake's, their pearls seeming to pulse in unison. "The member of our tribe who first received these tokens wrote that they would return in a time of great change," he announced. "Not to stop progress, but to guide it in harmony with the natural world." What happened next defied explanation. As the morning sun reached its peak, both necklaces began to emit a soft, pearl-like glow. The leopards outside moved in perfect unison, approaching the courthouse steps. Leading them was Jake's friend, the one he'd saved years ago, carrying something in its mouth. The big cat padded through the open doors, causing a ripple of movement as people stepped back in awe. It walked directly to Emma, who stood perfectly still, her eyes wide with wonder. At her feet, it placed a single pearl, one that seemed to contain swirling patterns of all the others combined. The third token, Standing Bear breathed. "The legends speak of it, the pearl of future generations." Emma carefully picked up the pearl, and as she did, the leopard gently pressed its forehead against her hand. The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that many in the room found themselves blinking back tears. "What does it mean?" Emma whispered, looking from the pearl to Jake. "It means the Guardians trust us to continue what we've started here," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "They're passing their protection to the next generation." The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, soon to become a symbol of hope for conservation efforts worldwide. But for those present, no photograph could capture the profound sense of connection that filled the room, between humans and animals, between generations, between progress and preservation. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of the community was remarkable. The Wildlife Research Center's funding exceeded all expectations, with universities and conservation groups competing to be involved. Emma's school launched an environmental education program that became a model for districts across the country. The Wapiti tribe received recognition and resources to protect their cultural heritage and share their traditional knowledge. Local businesses adapted to ecotourism, creating sustainable jobs that supported both the economy and the environment. The leopards remained neither hiding nor flaunting their presence, maintaining the delicate balance between wild and watchful. 1 year later, Jake stood on his porch at dawn, watching the sun rise over the protected forest. The necklace had become a familiar warmth against his skin, a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. Emma, staying for the weekend, sat beside him, her pearl now set in a simple bracelet that glowed softly in the early light. "Look, Grandpa," she whispered, pointing to the tree line. There stood the leopard, his old friend, watching them with those intelligent eyes. But this time, it wasn't alone. A cub peeked out from behind its legs, curious and cautious, representing the next generation of guardians. Michael and Amy, coming out to join them on the porch, paused at the sight. The family stood together, watching as more leopards emerged, adults and cubs, walking boldly along the edge of the forest, that would now always be their home. "You know," Michael said quietly, "when you first told us about the leopard and the necklace, I thought you'd lost your mind. But now I understand what you meant about being caretakers of the land." Amy nodded, her hand on Emma's shoulder. "My students ask me if the stories are true, about the guardians, the necklaces, all of it. I tell them some things have to be believed to be seen." Jake touched his necklace, feeling its steady warmth. The pearls had never lost their luster, never stopped reminding him of that morning 7 years ago when he'd found a wounded cub. One small act of kindness had sparked a movement that would protect this land for generations to come. Standing Bear had said it best at the research center's groundbreaking ceremony. The Guardians didn't choose this place because it was special. It became special because they showed us how to see it through their eyes. As the sun climbed higher, the leopards melted back into their forest. Emma's pearl glowed briefly brighter, then settled into its usual subtle shimmer. Jake looked at his family, at the protected land before them, and at the community that had learned to see the world differently. The necklace warmed against his skin one final time, and Jake smiled, understanding its message. Some stories don't end. They evolve, passing from generation to generation, changing and growing like the forest itself. The leopards would remain, watching and waiting, reminding humans that progress doesn't have to mean destruction, that ancient wisdom and modern life can coexist, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple choice to protect something wild and free.